Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the content patch for the 9th of April 2013. My name is TotalBiscuit with today's gaming news and comment. Coming up in the show, the creators of the Ouya console respond to negative reviews of the system. Thief will be locked at 30 frames per second on PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720 platforms. Thief will also include no competitive multiplayer, and Square-Enix detail losses on Sleeping Dogs, Hitman, and Tomb Raider. The Ouya, or as I like to call it, the Ouya Games console, made its way out to some of its Kickstarter backers recently, and curiously enough, a couple of reviews popped up on tech sites The Verge and Engadget. The Verge's review went as far as to give it a score, that being 3.5 out of 10, and reviews have cited numerous problems, including supposed lag on the system every now and again, as well as issues with the actual interface itself, which is a reskinned Android 4.1 operating system, along with sticky buttons on the controllers. They also criticized its so-called launch lineup, claiming that most of the games aren't really all that very good, and the ones that are familiar to those who actually have a smartphone to begin with. So basically a lack of killer apps, which of course is something that plagues a lot of consoles these days. In a statement released to GamesIndustry.biz, the creators of the console responded, claiming that the Ouya wasn't actually ready for review, and this was an exclusive preview period for early supporters. The actual system itself will be coming out around June the 4th, and there were no actual review copies shipped to press, nor the intention for the system to be reviewed yet. The creators continued by stating that the preview period is to test their ecosystem and fine-tune the experience, with promises of including more features in the actual operating system and refining the interface. Other features posted on the Ouya website, which will hopefully make it before release, include a simplified installation process, as well as more payment options, controller support for video player apps, as well as external storage solutions. So do we have to bring back an old axiom or something like that? Is that how we're going to have to do things now? Are we getting to the point where we give scored reviews to clearly beta products? Is that how it's going to be? Alright, well, beta is beta. An old phrase that I like to stick by. And it means very simply that this is not ready for final assessment. It is open to critique, and indeed you should critique it. The reason you should critique it in a constructive manner is to provide useful feedback that can be used by the creator in order to improve the product prior to its release. However, you must give it the benefit of the doubt because it is clearly not done yet. If these were review units, then yes, you would be justified in giving this thing a score. And I don't blame The Verge for going in there first because, hey, they got a unit. They can use it. They can make some content about it. I would probably do the same thing. But what I wouldn't do is give it a bloody score. That kind of finality is completely dishonest with a system that is blatantly not done yet. And we knew it wasn't done. You know what the release date is. It clearly states it on the website. You also know that the guys getting it early are getting it early. A more extreme example of this would be the Oculus Rift, for instance. It's like reviewing the Oculus Rift right now in its development kit phase. Like, oh, well, this doesn't work, and oh yeah, Oculus Rift gets 4 out of 10. It's not done yet. You don't get to give it a damn score. In fact, I find the fact that Verge did this to be severely link-baity and honestly designed as a piece of coverage that would really get the hate jerk around this particular machine going. It's curious, really. I haven't seen this much hate jerking and blatant elitism surrounding something so obviously cheap and aimed at a different demographic for quite some time. This is not a console that is aimed at hardcore gamers. One might pick one up, for instance, in order to set it up as an emulation box, but aside from that, you wouldn't really want to do it. It is a console that appears to be aimed at a lower income demographic with cheaper games, free-to-play trial of everything, a nice portable and unobtrusive form factor, and just in general a machine that just doesn't cost a lot of money. And it's also got this weird hackable side to it as well, so who knows where it goes. And yet, the just sheer amount of elitism just piling onto this machine is just actually getting ridiculous, and I've spoken about sites like Kotaku, for instance, being blatantly pandery in terms of trying to link bait and nerd bait and get people onto their site. through controversial topics and unbalanced discussion. I have no doubt that at some point in the past I've done exactly the same thing. It's a very easy trap to fall into. You notice a current hot topic on something like Reddit or 4chan or NeoGAF, and what do? Well, you create a piece of content that kind of feeds into that. Maybe it doesn't really offer anything new, but people will go watch it anyway because confirmation bias is a real bitch. It's the kind of thing that people suffer from and don't even understand. In the case of the EO, for instance, every single article that ended up on the front page of r/games, which is a subreddit I read fairly frequently, it's alright, it's not bad, has been negative. Every single one of them. The positive stuff doesn't get upvoted because that's not what people want to hear, and as a result, since they hear all about this negative stuff, they think that obviously this thing sucks, right? Because they're only hearing the negative, and that's where confirmation bias becomes a real problem. You're ignoring the other stuff in favor of your particular preset point of view. That is not a good thing. It's hardly the only thing to suffer from this either, honestly. I mean, you can look at the Xbox, for instance, next-gen Xbox, pretty much nothing but negative articles and rumors consistently hitting the front page, and yet there's a bunch of positive stuff for the PlayStation 4 always hitting the front page. And yet I'd never seen anything negative about that. What's going on there? Well, it's obvious that the general populist opinion is, well, we like the PS4 and we don't like the 720, so we'll upvote the good stuff about the PlayStation 4, we'll upvote the bad stuff about the Xbox 720. And this is kind of a similar situation. I feel that The Verge is extremely, and I do mean extremely irresponsible giving this damn thing a score. And even though they disclaimed at the bottom saying, oh, well, you know, it's not kind of done yet, don't give it a bloody score. That's the kind of thing that dwells in the mind of people. As far as I'm concerned, you shouldn't be scoring anything until it's actually a final product. I mean, hell, if I had my way, you wouldn't be scoring anything whatsoever. And it just applies all these unnecessary connotations. If you just write a piece that says, hey, so I got an early Ouya unit, and here's what I saw with it, and here's what I experienced, and I like this, and I didn't like this, and overall I think that in its current state it's pretty bad, and this is what they're going to change, and then you just leave it at that, that's kind of cool. That's fine. That's a nice piece of pre-release critique, and then you can follow up and you can reference that in your full review once the thing actually comes out, but you don't review unfinished products. It's stupid. The one thing I will point out from that review, which I feel is a very valid point indeed, is that they don't believe it will be possible within the next few months prior to release to actually fix all of the problems that they've noticed with it. I mean, they certainly can't fix the physical joystick problems. The pad isn't going to get recalled and changed, so if there's a fundamental design problem with the pad, then that's going to really suck. And can they fix the lag problem that's been reported on the Verge and Engadget? I don't know. It's a good question. And as for software support, well, that's the kind of thing that sort of evolves over time, but at the end of the day, it is a test period. This is Kickstarter. This is the way that things work. Generally speaking, you don't actually have much frame of reference with this kind of thing. This hasn't been happening previously. This is a crowdsourced project, and as a result, yes, people are getting it early when it's not necessarily in a fit state to be reviewed. So for the love of God, don't review it. Quit being a dumbass. Do some good constructive criticism on it, write a few articles by all means, and then chronicle its progression all the way up to release. And that makes an interesting series. That's informative to the consumer, and it's not misleading. Speaking to Videogamer.com, IDOS Montreal producer Stephen Roy spoke on the subject of Thief and its projected frame rate on next-generation consoles. This is for the PlayStation 4 and one must assume the Xbox 720, and the Thief developer claims that it will be capped at 30 frames per second, and also goes on to say that 60 frames per second is not a necessity. He went on to explain their logic behind this, saying that they would prefer to have better physics within the PlayStation 4 version of Thief rather than 60 frames per second. He also went on to explain that for a first-person shooter, it is a no-brainer. The higher the frame rate, the better it is. However, for the type of game they're working on, they don't want to put extra pressure on the team just because we can do it if it's not a necessity. If the players see nothing different, maybe I would prefer to have better physics and stuff like that and not this 60 frames per second frame rate. Well, I am kind of disappointed. I think maybe you guys are expecting me to go off on them for 10 minutes. And I almost did, and then I had a few thoughts here and there, so let's talk about this issue, shall we? So, I don't necessarily disagree with his idea that for shooters, the higher the frame rate, the better. Yup, absolutely. I can barely play shooters at 30 frames per second, and the faster a shooter is, the worse it is at 30 frames per second. That's something to consider. Try playing something like Rise of the Triad or Quake 3 or Unreal Tournament at 30 frames per second to tell me how far you get. The answer is you won't, because it's bad. It's very, very hard to be precise when you have that sluggish a response rate. So with Thief, you've got to wonder, alright, this is kind of a slow-moving game here and there. Would this be okay at 30 frames per second? The answer is yes, it'll be okay at 30 frames per second. The problem I've got with that is that I'm not really okay with okay. I want more. I want more out of my system. Now, some people are speculating that the fact that this will be 30 frames per second is indicative that the machine is very easy to reach its performance cap with, and that they've already hit the ceiling before the machine's even out. Well, those people don't know much about games consoles, because this never frickin' happens. No, seriously. Whenever you get a launch title, anything targeted around launch, there is no way in a million years that that title is going to be better looking than stuff that comes out 3 to 4 to 5, even 6, 7 years down the road. If you compare Gears of War Judgment to Gears of War, you will notice a significant increase in fidelity. Even across the series, Gears of War 2 looked better than 1, Gears of War 3 looked better than 2, Halo 4 looks better than Halo 3, just in terms of pure fidelity, not aesthetic. This keeps happening. Look at launch titles for Xbox 360 versus the titles that are coming out now for it. I mean, seriously. It's not even close. The concern, however, is that more companies will go down this route of saying, you know what, we want better physics and graphical fidelity as opposed to 60 frames per second. Because yes, rendering at a higher frame rate is something that hurts the hardware. Rendering twice the number of frames takes a lot of juice. But here's the thing, it makes the game look and play so much better. The question is, how much better does it make it play on a console? That's the thing, isn't it? There's the trick. Now, if you play a game in 30 frames per second and then you play a game in 60 frames per second on a PC, you are going to see and feel the difference. If you can't see the difference, which is entirely plausible, some of you aren't really used to it, and as a result, you can't spot it. I personally can spot the difference between 60 and 120, which some people can't do. And it varies from person to person. It varies on how much experience you happen to have with the hardware, how much of a PC gaming history you happen to have, and then just down to the individual. Some people just can't see higher frames per second, or they don't realize that they can see them, but they can feel them. That's the difference. 30 frames per second with mouse control feels way, way worse. It feels choppier than 60 frames per second. It makes aiming more difficult. It just makes everything more difficult. You can feel that. However, if you do that with a console, you do it with an analog stick, things are a little bit different. It's a very smooth experience. The movement is calculated and evened out and smoothed out. It's one of the reasons why mouse acceleration still exists, because it's a direct port over from the way the analog sticks work. They compensate for the fact that they're inherently less accurate, and in doing so, it does make it a little bit easier to play at 30 frames per second. There are games that I can play on console at 30 FPS and have a reasonable time with, but I can certainly see the difference, and it's blatantly better if it isn't running at that speed. Recently, I played Metal Gear Rising. That was at 60 frames per second, and I had a whale of a time with it. It versus any of the recent God of War games, just so much better in terms of the fluidity of the combat and the actual responsive nature of the game. And it's a little disappointing. It really is. It's unfortunate that they can't perhaps have both. It's like, oh, want better physics and graphics options. Couldn't we have a 60 FPS mode that doesn't have that stuff? Because I don't care. And if I was a console gamer, I would prefer to be playing at 60 FPS rather than having a few little bells and whistles. Physics, if it knocks my frame rate down significantly on my system, one, means the game's horribly optimized, but secondly, I would happily turn off in favor of a higher frame rate, always. I guess the problem with console games is you never really have options, whereas in PC games you do. Why can't I turn some of this stuff off on a console? That's a good question. I'd like a developer to answer that. Why is it that there are no actual options available on a console to tone the fidelity down? Why is that? Why is it we can't do that on a console and yet we can do it on a PC? If I want a higher frame rate, why can't I have that? It's strange, isn't it? Very odd. This whole trend is a little bit concerning, though. The new Killzone game, Shadowfall, is supposedly also targeting 30 frames per second. Oh god, I hate playing shooters at 30 FPS, I really do. So I will not be playing Killzone Shadowfall, that I can guarantee. I would rather play something on PC at 120 frames, thank you very much. Now, in slightly better news about Thief, it will feature no competitive multiplayer. Eidos Montreal has announced that, which is such a good thing. My god, I'm so happy about that. A good friend Stefan is back and spoke to Eurogamer on the issue, saying that right now, let's say competitive multiplayer, like the example that you just gave us of Tomb Raider, well, there's no plans for that. We are looking to see if there's maybe a challenge mode with some online component, but I'm going to be very honest with you, our main goal with this team is to give you the best single-player experience, just to bring back this franchise, to convince you a part of the future and not something holding on to the past. It's really demanding. I don't want to see my team wasting any energy. The thing about energy is, of course, he also means money there, yeah? And these things cost a lot of money. Development of games these days, as we're going to be going on to briefly in the last segment of this show, is damn expensive. Really is. If you want to make a comprehensive multiplayer mode, that's going to cost you a lot of time and a lot of money. You need developers for that. And potentially, if you don't have a big enough team or you don't have enough money, that takes away from the single-player experience. FIFA's never really been a multiplayer game, so why would we want it in the new game? The answer is we really wouldn't. I couldn't care less, and I'm glad that it's not there. I'm very glad that it isn't there. Tacked-on multiplayer modes is not exactly a new topic. I recall raging against it when the Darkness came out. Yes, the original Darkness. That was what, 2005, 2006? Something along those lines? That was a long time ago. And that had a tacked-on multiplayer mode. And thankfully, they got rid of that and replaced it with the kind of contracts-ish mode that was, I can't remember the name of it, that was in Darkness 2, which is much better. Much, much better. So I'm glad that this is coming back up again, and more to the point, I'm glad that some developers are shying away from it. Tomb Raider's multiplayer is okay, it's not really that bad. I don't feel it really detracts too much from the experience, and some would also argue that Uncharted's multiplayer is really, really solid, so you can have those games which you might think, oh, this is really a single-player game, have a really good multiplayer component and experience, but something like a classic PC game, something along those lines like Thief, which is very traditionally a lonely single-player stealth experience, no, we don't necessarily need that. I like the notion that when they're bringing the franchise back, they don't want to muck about with it. They want to make a good single-player game first, and maybe if it takes off, maybe if it does well, the next game has some kind of multiplayer component. And if you're going to put some kind of meta element in, like a challenge mode, like say the one in Hitman Absolution, fine. Cool. I'm alright with that. That's fine. Doesn't really take too much work, but I'm just so glad they're not sinking resources into something that no one really asked for. And finally, in their recent financial briefing, the guys over at Square-Enix have talked about the sales forecasts for their 3 biggest titles of last year and how they all failed to achieve their targets. The 3 big hitters for Square-Enix, Sleeping Dogs, Hitman Absolution, and Tomb Raider, sold 1.75 million copies, 3.6 million copies, and 3.4 million copies, respectively. Square Enix's former president, Yoichi Wada, explained that Sleeping Dogs was looking to sell 2 to 2.5 million units in the European and North American market based on its game's content, genre, and Metacritic scores. In the same way, game quality and Metacritic scores led us to believe that Hitman had the potential to sell 4.5 to 5 million units and 5 to 6 million units for Tomb Raider in Europe and North America, with the Japanese markets added in there. He went on to explain that they hedge their bets, basing the forecast on 80 to 90% of total sales potential. However, the results fell even lower than that. Wada went on to talk about the revenue model of Square Enix, describing it as outdated. Well, this is all horribly depressing, isn't it? Those were 3 games that, for the most part, give or take, were pretty damn good. I would say that Sleeping Dogs was one of my favorite titles that year. And then if you were to look at Tomb Raider, this seems to be a game that most people are really appreciating on a lot of different levels, myself included. I thought it was a pretty good game. Then, of course, you look at Hitman, and that was kind of mixed opinion here and there, but as this report accurately points out, they all had really good Metacritic scores, and they made predictions based on that, and they completely fell flat. So, 1, can we stop basing everything on Metacritic? I'm sorry, we're back on this again. It's convenient, I suppose, that Adam Sessler just talked about it again. I mean, he's the guy that actually held a panel a few years back that was very anti-Metacritic, and I tend to follow with his reasoning on that. Metacritic has too much value associated with it. Scores don't really mean anything, and you cannot reliably judge sales metrics and forecasts based on Metacritic scores. As a direct result, you should not be handing out bonuses or closing down studios on the basis of Metacritic scores, because that makes you an idiot. And honestly, as much as it pains me to admit it, because I really do like those games from Square-Enix. I thought they did a pretty damn fantastic job last year. They put out some really great titles, and they also had great PC support as well, so I very much appreciate that. Good ports, HD texture packs, primary version on PC, that kind of thing. It's good stuff, good stuff. But I've got to say, I kind of hope that a few more games fail in this way, so that publishers start to realize, oh yeah, Metacritic's actually not that useful at all. We should not really be relying on reviewers' scores in order to make business decisions. It is far too volatile, it is far too arbitrary, and it is far too nebulous. These scores are not consistent, and even if you apply Metacritic, it's still not consistent, because that in itself skews the whole bloody thing. I guess it's also unfortunate that these good titles from Square Enix came out at the end of a console's life cycle where less people are buying console games. We talked about the fall. It was, what, about 18% fall in console game spending? And while the PC market is pretty strong, it is still behind in terms of the sales of AAA games. So you can't rely on the PC market to be your supporter, especially with the obvious piracy problems. And yes, I know there's piracy on consoles, but it's not to the level that it is on PC. So this kind of sucks for Square Enix. I really hope that they don't decide to go all in on their social game strategy, because they were saying that, yeah, our social games have been doing better. Yeah, I mean, I would imagine they would be, especially if you're focusing on mobile platforms there. Those are pretty good ways to make money right now, but I want to see Square Enix publish really good core games, and they've been doing that recently, and apparently have not been rewarded for it. It also brings into sharp focus, I think, the sheer amount of money that is spent on these things. If you can't make your money back on Tomb Raider after selling 3.5 million copies, bearing in mind, of course, that this game has only been out for, what, a month, 2 months at most, then there is something wrong with your business model. You're spending too much money, and you are making silly predictions, and please stop it. I know making games is very, very expensive. Ridiculously expensive. I don't think you could truly understand it until you look at the numbers. But this isn't working out so well, and this needs to stop failing. Something needs to change. If I knew what, then I wouldn't be making videos on the internet. I'd be the CFO of Square Enix. Alright folks, that's me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the content patch, and I will see you next time.